The apple was the color of a bruise, half buried in the mud at the edge of the road where the wheel ruts had turned the earth to soup. Clara Finch wiped it on her skirt, what was left of her skirt, and bit into it anyway. It was mealy and bitter at the core, the kind of apple that had fallen not because it was ripe, but because it had given up. She understood the feeling. She was 22 years old and had walked 11 miles since sunrise. The town of Harlan, Montana, sat somewhere behind her, 3 days behind her now, along with everything she had once called her life. Her father's general store, the only thing her family had owned outright in 3 generations, had burned to the ground on a Wednesday night in October. The fire marshal had called it an accident. The men at the bank had called it an opportunity. Within a week, they had called in the loan her father had taken out against the land, a loan she had not known existed until a man in a clean coat arrived at their door with a piece of paper and a sympathetic expression that fooled neither of them. Her father's hands had shaken when he signed the release. He had died 4 months later, quietly, in the way that men who have outlived their purpose sometimes do. Her mother had gone to live with a cousin in Billings. There was no room for Clara, so she had walked. She had a canvas sack over one shoulder with a spare dress, a hairbrush, her mother's Bible, and $8.40. She had a pair of boots that had been resoled twice and were on their 3rd argument with her heels. And she had a brain that her school teacher, old Mrs. Birch, had called the sharpest mind she had seen in 20 years of teaching, which had done Clara very little practical good so far. The land here was different from Harlan, wider somehow, even though she would not have thought that possible. The hills rolled away in every direction under a sky that was the pale, washed-out blue of old Denham. A creek ran parallel to the road, its banks thick with cottonwood gone gold with autumn. Somewhere, a meadowlark was singing, which seemed to Clara an outright act of defiance against the cold. She heard the wagon before she saw it. It came from the north, moving at a working pace, not fast, not slow, the kind of pace that covered ground without wasting the horses. She stepped to the side of the road without thinking about it. She had learned in 3 days of walking that it was better not to stand in the middle of things. The wagon slowed. She did not look up immediately. She had learned that too. The horses stopped, the creak of the brake lever. Silence, except for the creak and the meadowlark. She felt the weight of a gaze. She had been looked at in the past 3 days in ways she did not care to remember. She set her jaw and stared at the middle distance, holding herself as straight as her tired back would allow. "You come far?" The voice was a woman's. Clara looked up. The woman on the wagon seat was somewhere near 50, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with iron-gray hair pinned severely beneath a black hat. She wore a canvas duster that had seen serious use. Her eyes were the color of river stones, gray and assessing, and she looked at Clara the way a person looks at a structural problem, with interest rather than sentiment. "From Harlan," Clara said. The woman's eyebrows lifted a fraction. "That's 11 miles. 12, by my count." Something shifted in the woman's expression. Not quite a smile, more like the beginning of an opinion. She looked at the canvas sack, at the worn boots, at Clara's face. She seemed to be reading a page of small print very quickly. "You have work?" she asked. "I'm looking for it." "What kind?" Clara thought about lying, about saying something impressive and useful. Instead, she said the plain truth. "Any kind. I can keep books. I can cook. I can sew. I can teach if there are children. I wrote my father's letters and managed his accounts for 6 years. I'm not afraid of early mornings or hard work, and I don't complain." The woman studied her for a long moment. "Can you keep a set of double-entry ledgers?" Clara blinked. Of all the things she had been asked in the past 3 days, this was the first question that had startled her. "Yes," she said. "I can. Get in." The woman's name was Margaret Holt. She owned the Holt Land and Cattle Company, 4,200 acres in the Powder River Basin, which she had run alone for 7 years since her husband had been killed by a horse that should have been put down 2 seasons earlier. She told Clara this in the tone of someone reading from a list of facts, without self-pity or drama. She seemed allergic to both. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road as the afternoon began to tip toward evening. It was not what Clara had expected. She had expected something rough, a bachelor's place gone to ruin, the way Ellis Brand's kitchen had been a ruin in stories her mother used to tell about widowed ranchers. Instead, the house was solid and well kept, the fences running clean and straight to the horizon. But the barns were understaffed, and she could see it in the small things. A gate hanging slightly wrong, a pile of harness left in the yard rather than hung. The thousand small signs of a place being held together by one will spread too thin. Margaret Holt ran a tight ship. She simply didn't have enough hands on the ropes. She showed Clara to a small room off the back of the house, clean and spare, with a window that looked out over the east pasture. A wash basin, a narrow bed, a lamp. "Supper at 6, Margaret said from the doorway. "I'll show you the books in the morning. You'll earn your wage by whether you can read them." "What is the wage?" Clara asked. Margaret told her. It was fair, not generous, but fair, which Clara had come to understand was considerably better than generous. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Margaret nodded once and pulled the door shut behind her. Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs, breathing. She was not safe yet. She knew that. She had not proven herself. But for the first time in 4 months, she had a floor under her feet and a roof over her head, and she had gotten there on the strength of 6 words. "Yes, I can keep ledgers." She got up, washed her face, and went to help with supper. The books were a disaster, not in the way that careless books were a disaster, with numbers entered wrong and columns that didn't sum. Margaret Holt was not careless. The books were a disaster in the way that a very capable person's books become when that person is doing the work of 4 people simultaneously and has no time to record any of it properly. Transactions were entered in the wrong period. Cattle tallies were written on 3 separate pages with no cross-reference. A contract with a hay supplier from 2 years ago had been renewed verbally and never written down at all, which Clara only discovered because she found the original in a stack of correspondence that had been used to weight down a loose board on the desk. She didn't say a word about any of it. She simply started at the beginning. She worked at the roll-top desk in the corner of the sitting room from 6 in the morning until the light failed. She reorganized the accounts by year and by category. She found a discrepancy in the feed invoices going back 18 months. A supplier who had been overcharging by 12% on every order, consistent enough to be deliberate. She wrote the total in the margin in red and set it aside. Margaret Holt came in on the 3rd evening, poured herself a cup of coffee, and stood behind Clara, looking at the rebuilt ledger without a word. "The feed merchant in Billings," Clara said without turning around. "A man named Grantham. He's been overcharging you. $412 over 18 months. Here." She tapped the page. "And here, and here." Silence. "There's no written record of your hay contract with the Swenson brothers," Clara continued. "The verbal terms you appear to have been operating on are here." She held up a letter. "The original, from 1,887. But the price per ton listed here is lower than what you've been paying. Either the terms changed and were never recorded, or someone changed them without your knowledge." More silence. Clara turned around. Margaret Holt was looking at her with an expression that was harder to read than the ledgers. It was not the look of a woman who had found a useful employee. It was the look of a woman who had found something she had not known she was looking for. "Where did you learn this?" Margaret asked. "My father's store," Clara said. "I kept his books from the time I was 14. He trusted me with every number in the business." She paused. The bank that called in his loan didn't know that. They thought there was no one left who understood the accounts. They were wrong. "Why didn't you fight them?" Margaret's voice was direct, not unkind. "I tried," Clara said simply. "I didn't have enough." She looked back at the ledger. "But I understand numbers, Mrs. Holt, and I understand what it means when someone uses them against you." Margaret set her coffee cup down on the corner of the desk. "Grantham will deny it. He'll have a hard time denying his own invoices," Clara said, and laid out the sequence, each overcharged bill in order, clean, and irrefutable. For the first time since Clara had arrived, Margaret Holt smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that a person offers when they are genuinely surprised by something, but it was real. "Write him a letter," she said. "Tell him we've completed an audit." "I already have a draft," Clara said. She produced it from under the ledger. Margaret read it. She made one small correction, a single word, and handed it back. "Send it tomorrow." It was not the moment their partnership was formed. That had happened 3 days earlier on a dirt road, when Clara had told the plain truth instead of a useful lie. But it was the moment both of them knew it. The month settled into a rhythm. Clara kept the books and Margaret ran the cattle, and somewhere in the overlap between those two things, the ranch began to run more cleanly than it had in years. The Grantham overcharge was recovered, not in full but in enough, the feed merchant apparently deciding that a partial settlement was preferable to whatever Clara's letter had implied awaited him otherwise. The Swenson Hay contract was renegotiated and written down, this time, in triplicate, with Clara's signature as witness. The ranch hands were skeptical of Clara in the way that men are skeptical of anything that appears in their world without a clear precedent. She was too young, too pretty, and too quiet. And they had learned from experience that people who were quiet around them were usually hiding something. But Clara wasn't hiding anything. She was watching. She watched the way the foreman, a lean, sun-worn man named Caleb Voss, ran the morning assignments. She noticed that he sent the oldest hand, a man named Rufus who moved on a bad knee, to the south pasture every single day, which meant Rufus was riding an extra mile each way on a leg that should have been rested. She also noticed that the south pasture could be checked from the ridge in half the time if you took the northeast fence line, a fact that apparently no one had thought to mention to anyone. She mentioned it to Caleb one morning, without preamble. As he was reading out the day's assignments at the barn door, he stared at her. "The ridge line," she said. "It saves about a mile on the south pasture check." Rufus's knee would thank him. The other hands went very still in the way that men go still when they are pretending not to pay attention to something. Caleb Voss looked at her for a long moment. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man who had been foreman for 11 years and had not been given suggestions by the bookkeeper before. "I'll consider it," he said, in a tone that meant he wouldn't. He sent Rufus on the northeast fence line the next morning. He didn't say why. Clara didn't ask. After that, the hands started acknowledging her when she came into the barn. It wasn't warmth. Not yet, but it was something. The real trouble arrived in March. It came in the form of a letter first, from a law firm in Helena, written on heavy cream paper with an embossed letterhead that was designed to communicate exactly one thing: money and the power it carried. The letter was addressed to Margaret Holt and concerned a water rights claim on the Powder Creek tributary that ran through the northwest corner of the ranch property. A mining consortium, the letter explained, had filed a prior appropriation claim on the creek's flow, and the Holt Ranch's use of that water for cattle was, the letter regretted to inform her, in conflict with the consortium's established rights. It was, in plain language, an attempt to cut off the water supply to the northwest pasture, where Margaret ran her breeding stock. Without that water, the breeding herd would have to be moved. Moving the breeding herd would cost money the ranch didn't have, and would disrupt the spring calving season in ways that could set the entire operation back by 2 years. Margaret read the letter twice at the kitchen table, her face unreadable. Then she handed it to Clara without a word. Clara read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly. "Prior appropriation," she said. "The law in Montana," Margaret said. "First in time, first in right. Whoever filed the claim first owns the water. When did this consortium file? They say 1889. When did your family first use that creek?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "My husband ran cattle on that creek from 1879. Clara set the letter down flat on the table and pressed her fingertips against the edge of it. "Then they don't have a prior claim," she said. "You do. Proving it is another matter." "Do you have any records from 1879? Clara asked. "Bills of sale, brand registrations." Any correspondence that mentions the Northwest pasture or the creek by name. Margaret was quiet for a moment. There are boxes, she said, in the attic. James never threw anything away. She said her dead husband's name the way people say the names of the useful dead, with practicality and the faintest edge of grief. May I look? Clara asked. The attic was 3 decades of a ranching life, compressed into rough pine crates and canvas-wrapped bundles and a trunk that had come, by the look of it, all the way from Ohio. Clara spent 4 days in it. She came down each evening covered in dust, ate supper in near silence, and went back up at first light. Margaret watched her without comment and kept a lamp burning in the window. On the 5th day, Clara came down the attic stairs, holding a water-stained ledger and a folded piece of paper. She spread them on the kitchen table. The ledger was James Holt's original ranch journal, dated 1878 through 1881. In his round, careful handwriting, he had recorded every significant event on the property, including, on a page dated the 14th of April, 1879, the digging of a stock tank fed by the northwest tributary of the Powder Creek, and a note that read, "Water running clean and good, cattle watered by noon, this land will do." The folded paper was a letter from the Territorial Water Office, dated June 1879, acknowledging James Holt's registered water use claim on the tributary. It had never been filed with the county courthouse. It had sat in a trunk in an attic for 15 years. Clara set it beside the mining consortium's letter. She had written the comparison of dates on a clean sheet of paper in her careful hand. The numbers were unambiguous. James Holt had registered his water use in June of 1879. The consortium's claim dated from 1889, 10 years of prior use, documented in the territorial record, in the man's own handwriting, in ink that had faded but not disappeared. Margaret Holt stood at the kitchen table and looked at the 2 documents for a very long time. Then she looked at Clara. "How did you know to look for this?" she asked. "I didn't even remember James had kept that journal." "My father kept journals," Clara said. "Men who care about the land always do." She paused. "I was looking for any mention of the creek. I found the stock tank entry first, and then I kept looking because I knew if he'd written it down, he'd have registered it. Men like your husband don't leave things unregistered." A silence settled in the kitchen, a long and particular silence that was different from the working silences they had learned to share over months. This one had a different weight to it. "Clara," Margaret said finally. She said it the way she didn't usually say it, not as a summons or a practical address, but as the name of a person she was looking at squarely. "When did you last have a real plan for yourself? Not a job, a plan." Clara held her gaze. "I'm not sure I know the difference anymore." "Then I'll be plain," Margaret said. She sat down across the table from Clara, folding her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm not a sentimental woman. I don't make speeches. But I've had 3 bookkeepers since James died, and not one of them did in 6 months what you did in 3 days. Not one of them would have known to go looking in the attic. And not one of them would have found that letter even if I'd handed them the trunk and a lamp." She paused. "I'm getting older. The work of this place is more than one person, and I've been pretending otherwise for long enough." Clara waited. "I'd like you to stay," Margaret said. "Not as a hired bookkeeper. As a partner. A proper one. With a share of the operation and your name on the paper alongside mine." She let that land. "I have no children. I have no family in a position to take this on. What I have is 4,000 acres and the best set of books in the Powder River Basin, because you made them that way." A pause, deliberate and serious. "And I have a very strong feeling, Clara Finch, that in 5 years this ranch will be worth twice what it is today if we run it together." The kitchen was perfectly quiet. Outside, the March wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, the sound of it like water itself. Clara thought about the apple she had bitten into on the road. She thought about her father's shaking hands and the man with the sympathetic expression. She thought about what it meant to have a floor under your feet, and whether a floor was enough, or whether a person was entitled to want the whole house. She looked at Margaret Holt. This iron-gray woman who had held 4,200 acres together by pure force of will, who had not offered sympathy or charity or pity, who had offered instead a question about double-entry ledgers and then gotten out of the way. "I have one condition," Clara said. Margaret's eyebrow lifted a fraction. "The Northwest Tributary claim goes to the county courthouse, filed properly, this time." She touched the letter with one finger. "I won't build on ground that could still be pulled out from under us." Something moved in Margaret Holt's expression. Respect, perhaps, or the recognition of it. "I'll have Caleb hitch the wagon Monday morning," she said. They shook hands across the kitchen table, the two of them, over the water-stained journal and the letter that had been sleeping in a trunk for 15 years, waiting for someone to know what to look for. The consortium's lawyers wrote twice more. Clara answered both letters herself, with the calm and thorough precision of someone who has all the dates memorized and would be happy to explain them again. The third letter never came. Spring arrived, and with it the calving season, and the ranch moved into the particular beautiful chaos of new life. Clara learned to read a calf's first hour the way she read a column of figures, looking for the small signs that predicted what would come. She learned which mothers needed watching and which could be trusted to manage on their own. Caleb Voss, who had not spoken more than 12 words to her between November and February, began leaving her notes in the morning about the night's events in the calving barn, not because he had been told to, but because he had decided she needed to know. He never mentioned the northeast fence line. She never mentioned it either. By summer, she was riding out with Margaret to the far pastures, carrying a notebook in her saddlebag to record what she observed. She had no illusions about her horsemanship. She was adequate, no more, and she knew it. But she had an eye for the land and for what it could produce, and Margaret trusted that eye, and the two of them together saw more than either of them saw alone. The thing they were building had no name for a while. It wasn't quite a friendship, and it wasn't quite a business, and it wasn't quite a family, though it had the bones of all three. It was what happened when two capable women, each one shaped by a different version of losing everything, decided to stop managing loss and start making something instead. Margaret was not an easy woman to know. She was not given to warmth as a first language. But she was honest. She was fair. She remembered every kindness and said nothing about it. And on the day that Clara registered the water rights at the county courthouse and came home with the stamped copy folded in her coat pocket, Margaret put a bottle of whiskey on the kitchen table and poured 2 glasses without being asked. They drank them looking out the window at the northwest pasture, where the breeding herd grazed along the bank of the tributary in the afternoon light. "James would have liked you," Margaret said. Clara looked at the creek, shining in the late sun. "I think I would have liked him," she said. 3 years later, the ranch ran 12% above its best previous yield. The books were clean and current and cross-referenced in a system that Clara had designed herself. Caleb Voss, who had made his peace with suggestions a long time ago and had come to understand that a woman who noticed things was a considerably more useful colleague than one who didn't, had trained 2 new hands using a pasture rotation schedule that Clara had mapped out over a long winter with graph paper and a great deal of coffee. The Grantham feed merchant had been replaced. The Swenson hay contract had been renegotiated twice. A new contract with a cattle buyer in Miles City, negotiated by Clara across a table of men who had underestimated her once and not made that mistake a second time, had improved their market price by $8 a head. And on an October afternoon, with the cottonwoods burning gold along the creek and the smell of wood smoke beginning to drift down from the hills, Clara Finch sat at the roll-top desk that was now fully and undisputably hers, and looked at the ledger she had rebuilt from ruin and the years of careful figures she had added to it since, and she let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what she had made. She thought of the road, the muddy apple, the boots arguing with her heels. She thought of the question that had changed everything, asked by a woman on a wagon seat who had looked at her with river-stone eyes and seen not a girl in trouble, but a problem worth solving. Can you keep a set of double-entry ledgers? The lamp was burning on the desk. The books were in order. The creek was running clean through the northwest pasture, registered and protected and undisputed. The calf count for the year was the best in the ranch's history. Outside the window, Margaret was crossing the yard toward the barn, moving with the same purposeful stride she had always moved with, unhurried and solid, a woman who belonged to the land she walked on. She paused at the barn door and looked back at the house, and Clara raised a hand from the window, and Margaret lifted her chin in the slight, brisk acknowledgement that was, from her, the equivalent of a warm embrace. It had not been a rescue, not from Margaret's side and not from Clara's. It had been a transaction, fairly made, and a partnership, honestly kept, and somewhere in the daily accumulation of shared work and mutual trust, it had become something neither of them had planned for, and both of them had needed. Some things grow quiet and deep, the way roots grow, invisible and unremarkable until the day you realize they are the reason the whole tree is still standing. Clara turned back to the ledger and dipped her pen. There was work to do. There was always, pleasantly and gratefully, work to do. When you have lost the floor beneath your feet, the truest thing you can do is tell the plain truth about what you are capable of, and then prove it, quietly, one day at a time. Clara didn't wait to be rescued. She brought what she had, a clear mind and honest hands, and she put it to work. That is always enough to begin. And beginnings, it turns out, have a way of becoming everything. A small note for you, dear friend. This story was imagined and written by AI, offered as a little entertainment for your day, and a reminder that the right opportunity often arrives, not as luck, but as the question you were already ready to answer.